I see you found our little hiding spot in the universe. Don't get too comfortable. This is a place where you will find those with an experience that's out of this world, and possibly deep within your life. I welcome you to the Oracles with James Tyson. Lean forward and listen. We will pull you into a supernatural journey with guests from around the world, each one experiencing some of the most extraordinary phenomena this wee planet has to offer. Now, here are the Oracles with James Tyson.
Why, thank you, Liam. And thank you, listener, for tuning into today's episode of The Oracles with James Tyson. It's me, James, and joining me today is author Morgan Daimler. She's a witch who has been a polytheist since about the early 90s. She's followed a path inspired by the Irish fairy faith blended with neopagan witchcraft. Morgan teaches classes on Irish myth and mystical practices, fairies, and related subjects in the United States and internationally, and has been published in multiple anthologies as well as in Witches and Pagans magazine and Pagan Dawn magazine. She is one of the world's foremost experts in all things fairy. Besides the titles available through Moon Books, Morgan has self-published on Old and Middle English language translations called The Treasure of the Trua de Danann. And I'm probably screwed up the pronunciation of that. But it's an urban fantasy paranormal romance series called Between the Worlds. On top of her fantasy and fiction, she's published a lot of stuff that is nonfiction based on her research. We talk about the connection between higher vibration people, empaths, and seeing things in different dimensions, multiple dimensions, the fairy realm, elemental beings, Irish folklore, abductions. We get into the connection between, or the similarities between reported alien abductions and reported fairy abductions. And if you haven't heard about fairy abductions, is because in the last 20 years we've been fascinated more with aliens than what has been going on for a long time in regards to abductions or connections with fairies and people losing time. And we talk about folklore and folklore-esque, fake lore, the connections between modern fiction and how characters and scenarios in fiction have kind of moved into urban legend, and from urban legend into folklore and what would be called traditional legend. If you want to follow or connect with Morgan Daimler, please check her out. She's on Twitter, Morgan Daimler. Now, Daimler is spelled Daimler. Some people pronounce that Daimler, like the car dealers in Germany, Daimler-Benz, pronounced Daimler. Follow her on Twitter, Morgan Daimler. Also, Morgan Daimler author on the Facebook, if you have the Facebook still, or just Morgan Daimler on Facebook, send her a friend request. Very, very interesting young lady out of Connecticut, and she's written about 30 books on subjects relating to this Irish mythology, paganism, and fairies. Lots of stuff to poke through. So I'm going to go run down the hall here, open the door, push back some ferns, and go get Morgan Daimler. Morgan, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I am well. I am well here on the lower left Canadian coast, and it's fall, so it's drizzly and rainy, and I'd say the leaves have changed, but we don't have a lot of leafed trees here. We have mostly fir trees, and living in a rainforest on the west coast. Yeah. How about your weather out in semi-apocalypse Connecticut?
Well, much like yours, it is a little rainy and drizzly today. I love this sort of weather, though, so this is my happy weather, so that's okay.
That's a good thing. It's whatever makes you feel kind of, and these days are kind of the warm, snuggly days of, I recall as a kid, these were usually the weekends. I had 2 soccer games. So we get out there soaking wet, but when you realized you couldn't get any wetter, then you just kept playing the game anyway. And then went home and had a nice warm lunch, and that was the comfort food. That was the comfort days at the time. It was that drizzly West Coast weather. And
yes, it's definitely soup weather.
It's soup weather. Yeah, it's definitely soup. Or when I was a kid, wieners and beans, which is the thing that I first made, as that was my big gourmet invention when I was a kid.
I'm from northern Maine originally, so I grew up on beans, baked beans.
Baked beans and lobster.
Oh yeah. It's you can't live in Maine and not. It's like a requirement.
They come to your house. Yeah.
They do.
I'm sorry, you're gonna have to eat this. But no, we're having craft dinner. No. You got to add lobster. Yeah, that'd be great. You've got a number of books.
I do.
Like two dozen ish.
Yeah, I think I'm at 30.
30 books. Oh, you gotta just calm down. See what happened? You get the COVID timeout, and you're gonna sit home and write.
Yeah, well, you got to keep yourself busy.
That would do it.
Yeah.
I was supposed to write a book 4 years ago, and I can't put two sentences together, so I just smile and said, yeah, okay, I will.
Well, you have an awesome show that you do, so.
Yeah, I'd rather do this. Just talk to people.
So you can do this, and I'll keep writing, because I could not do this.
Oh, this is easy. Come on. We were talking before we went on air, and that was all you do is a similar conversation. Just turn a recorder on, and then try not to say bad things about your neighbors. And
well, yeah, that's probably important. Yeah.
Yeah, because your neighbors are going to be the only ones listening when that happens. How long have you been involved in this interesting topic of fairies and folklore and that whole otherworldly side of things?
I mean, honestly, I could say probably my entire life. Even when I was very small, I had a strong interest in these sorts of things. I guess that's sort of a broad way to say it. I've always sort of perceived these otherworldly beings and believed that they were around. And when I was very young, my parents, really just humored that and never discouraged me. And then when I got to be a little older, when I was in my, I guess you call it tweens now, I started really trying to study the written folklore and stories to have some sort of context for things. And then, it sort of progressed from there. And once you get into it, it's such a fascinating topic that it just kind of sucks you in.
Did you ever see them when you were a kid?
I did, yeah.
Okay, tell me about that.
I'm not sure we have enough time in this interview to get totally into that. Yeah. Well, there's a thing in Irish and Scottish belief and Irish American belief that's referred to as the sight or the second sight. And it's this idea that certain people have an ability to see spirits effectively, among, other things. There's a little more to it than that, but, effectively. And, even when I was very young, I would see things, human ghosts and fairies and things. And, to me, it was just a normal part of reality. Mm-hmm. And to my parents, I just had a really good imagination. So, it's kind of always been part of my life. Even as I got older, in some of the books, I talk about some of the experiences I had when I was in my early 20s, seeing things like fairy hounds, which are a specific type of fairy being, or, encountering different sorts of what we would call fairies, basically. Although, fairies really aren't what a lot of people imagine. That sort of, popular culture idea of fairies as being like the Disney Tinkerbell sort of thing. In cultural belief and like Irish, Scottish, Welsh, etc. belief in the diaspora, fairy is used more like as a catch-all term. for any being that kind of comes from that other world, that world of fairy. So you have, cats and dogs, fairy dogs, and some that can look like horses, and some that look like people, like humans, but aren't. And then things that, fall into that sort of Brian Froud artwork sort of description, like sometimes grotesque, but just not things that could pass as human, I guess we'd say. There's a whole range of things.
Yeah, I think looking back, the only time Tinkerbell was close to being a traditional fairy is when she was trying to kill Wendy.
That's
look,
true.
she's evil. Good, that's a real fairy. I saw a gnome when I was a kid.
Oh, cool.
Sort of. I thought
Cool,
it was
you had the experience.
Yeah, I thought it was like it was like one of those little garden gnomes.
Yeah.
And it was half out of the grass and half onto a path that I was jumping over a little ditch to walk down on. And I just thought, that's a weird place to put a gnome. And I looked down at the ditch, jumped over, came walking, and then the gnome was gone. So I walked up. I was at the place the gnome was, and there was nobody around. It was right beside a horse paddock, and I was actually going over to see the horses.
Yeah.
And there was, the little with the hat and the red jacket and the like what the heck did I just see? And I just wrote it off as being, I don't know, maybe I saw something and I just lost it when I looked up again or something.
Yeah.
But there was no reason to put a gnome out. But years later, a psychic said, "Oh, by the way, you did see something by the horses." And I looked at the psychic. It's like, okay, I don't know what you're talking about. And then it came to me going, yes. Yep. When I was 10, that's what happened. But that was my only experience with that. Tell me,
that's very cool though.
Do you wake up between 3 and 4:30 in the morning?
Often, especially the last 6 months in pandemic world.
Do you know you're dreaming while you're dreaming?
I'd say I do lucid dreaming about half the time.
Okay. And post-puberty, did you have an anxiety issue?
Yes.
I ask though because those are like when I look at somebody and I see they're a higher vibration. Those are my 3 questions, and they look at me and say, "How do you know all that?" Like, how do you know my life? I said, "I don't know your life. It's just that these are the byproducts of who you are."
Yeah, patterns.
Yeah, the patterns and
Yeah.
seeing things. And then, of course, the other one is, do you ever see shadows or stuff in your bedroom when you do wake up in those times? And it's like, oh, how did you know that? It says, I don't really know that. You're just one of us. So, and it's funny that they for empath, we'll call it an empath because it's so many other words, but there's never been really studies on how many human beings are that.
Right.
But there are studies on how many people lucid dream.
Really?
Yes, 24 to 29% of the population, depending on what study, especially in Germany. They've had a lot of studies in Germany. But it comes down to it that I've never met someone who is not a higher vibration person who doesn't lucid dream. So
interesting.
I'm kind of mixing the two together going, okay, if that's... if you lucid dream, you're most likely, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not going to say you're all lucid dreamers are all empaths or the higher vibration, but I haven't met somebody who isn't.
Right.
So, I don't know. So I'm kind of guessing. I guess a guesstimate. So I always ask people who are in tuned like you those questions to see where you fall in. So it kind of keeps my guesstimations going, or my theory on empaths and lucid dreaming going.
Oh, it's really interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you know a lot of other people who have similar experiences or, attunement, however you want to look at it, who do tend to wake up between 3 and 4 in the morning? So,
yes. You know why they're waking up?
I'd be afraid to guess.
Oh, don't be afraid. It's just humans. We bring human dead people home with us.
Huh.
And the veil thins between 3 and 4:30 in the morning, no matter what time zone you're in. And all day long, they're tapping us on the shoulder, wanting our attention. And between 3 and 4:30 in the morning, it's like they can push us and go, hey, while you're here, I was wondering if you could help me. And you wake up and there's shadows in your room.
So the energy kind of peaks.
Yeah, it's all it is. All day long, they're trying to get your attention. They're tapping, going, Morgan, hey, Morgan, hey, Morgan. And we don't hear them. And then between 3 and 4:30, it's like, Morgan. And you wake up and they're standing at the foot of your bed.
Interesting.
Ish. So, that's why. And it's nothing really scary, other than when we're kids, we wake up and there's something standing at the foot of our bed. So it's
right.
Like, okay, but there's rules. You can say, leave me alone, and they'll go away. But with little kids too, I've been in paranormal investigations where we've gone to people's houses because their 3-year-old wakes up screaming and runs into their bedroom because there's a guy sitting in the rocking chair talking to them, and there's a woman floating over the bed trying to get the kids' attention, and all they are happy to be around somebody with a vibration that's just glowing like that. He brings every dead human in the neighborhood over.
Right, and just drawn to it.
You can clear it. Like, you can do the whole smudging, clearing, whatever your ritual is for clearing, and they'll just step outside and wait for everything to calm down, and they'll come back in again because the energy is so good.
Yeah.
It's just getting that kid to understand eventually as they get older that they have control and they can basically set rules. But anyway, going off on another tangent. See what happens? So your experience with, like, we'll call it the other side, with elemental beings and that kind of thing. I kind of throw fairies into elemental beings because I don't know where else to put them in a category. Did that drop off at a certain time in your life? Did you see them was it a constant, or has it been sprinkled through your life?
For me personally, it's been a constant. I will say I have 3 children. Let me preface this by saying I have 3 children. And my 2 older children, when they were younger, used to talk about seeing things and experiences, and both of them that did drop off as they got older. Even though obviously we weren't discouraging it or, telling them it wasn't real, because sometimes that can cause children to kind of cut themselves off from things. But no, it just seemed like they hit a certain age and they just couldn't make that same connection they'd had when they were younger.
Oh, that's interesting. I know that there are certain times in a person's life where that type of experience isn't needed and it's turned off. I experienced I was in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 28 years, and I had seen dead people all my life. I saw ghosts.
Yeah.
It really, when I was actually hanging around with real dead people, I didn't see the dead people.
Yeah.
It was very seldom I saw them again. But it was like, we're going to shut that off at this block
for that point. That's interesting that you mentioned that. I was an emergency medical technician for years, and I, as I mentioned, I see spirits, I see human ghosts, and I see fairies. And when I was an EMT, I still had experiences seeing fairies at different points. But I only once, working as an EMT, saw a ghost. And I hadn't ever thought about that before, but that is a little weird now that you mention it. And maybe that is kind of along the same lines of what you were saying, that, at that particular point, that wasn't something I needed to be connected to.
I did have the experience once. I went to a car accident, and there was a lady standing outside the car, mm-hmm. and it was a 2-vehicle car accident. She was the only one outside the car, and I pulled up, got on the radio, said where I was, kind of got all my gear together, got up, and she was gone. I thought, oh, great. Where'd she go? Where's my witness?
Right.
And she was in the car, and she was dead. Mm-hmm. But when I first pulled up, she was standing outside the car looking into the car.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
But that was it. That was all of it in all the years I was doing it. Yep. I did have feelings. In hindsight, I had felt things around me and I was talking to them, which is a whole other story. It would be an interview about me and not you. But but I didn't have that as an EMT. I could see that as being not important at this time because you're working very hard to do something. Plus, it would be distracting for you and the people you were working with.
Yeah. Yeah. No, in all the years that I had done it, even dealing obviously with fatalities and assorted things like that, the only time I saw it was a head-on collision that was a fatality, but there was a miscommunication, I'll nicely say, as to what was supposed to be, how things were going to be handled. So we had started to transport the person, and then the paramedic declared them deceased, which it turns out you're not legally supposed to do. And so when we got to the hospital wouldn't take the person. And we obviously couldn't bring them back. So we ended up sitting in the emergency bay for a couple hours trying to get sorted out what was going to happen. And I looked out the rear of the ambulance and I saw the person that was on our stretcher standing, leaning against the wall, outside the hospital doors, basically. And that's the only time I ever saw a ghost when I was working as an EMT. But it was definitely a very strange circumstance, the whole situation.
Yeah. So it was out of sync, and you were probably overthinking. You're kind of confused, and you're rattled a bit.
Yeah.
Before you saw him. So you're a little bit rattled about the whole situation. So your energy was like a sparkler. And you opened yourself up.
Yeah, well,
most likely.
It was definitely open.
Yeah, it's weird. It's and I've talked to this about with other first responders who have had the experience when they were younger of seeing things, and again as they were older, but during their work, they didn't do it. Because and I know, when we get to I was only in uniform for about 9 years, but going to a car accident, if you're a first responder, if you're the first one there, you have a mental checklist you're going through, and it's very, very well planned, and you've got to do this and do that and do this. So it's like and people think, oh, how could you attend a scene that's all gross and there's blood and things? But we're very methodical in how we see things and how you look for, as you approach the scene and how you process it in your head.
Yeah,
and
very
then the mental
focused.
checklist. Yeah, the mental checklist you go through. You're not seeing a body. You're not seeing a child or a woman or a man. You're seeing a project that has to be a test. You're seeing a test you have to complete.
Right.
And you're just going through it. You don't have time to think, or you try to push the age of the person out of your head and things like that. You just have this project you have to complete. It's like it literally is. It's a test. You're just going through it. And I used to tell young cops that if you're going to a car accident and it's a really bad car accident and you're the third or fourth guy there, don't go to the car accident. Turn your back on it and direct traffic.
Yeah.
Because that's when you look at it with a different set of eyes, and that's when you bring home the stuff. That's
right.
I don't mean bring home the ghosts. I mean bring home the
trauma
yep. of seeing a child that's dead or somebody decapitated. But when you're first there, you're going through your checklist.
Right.
And
you have that list of things you've got to get done.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so
I agree.
Seeing a ghost at that time is not it's not for the benefit of the universe and all those involved. You are placed in that position at that time in history and that time in your life to complete a task. We're not going to throw a bunch of crap in on top of it to get you discombobulated, and you have to focus on what you're doing. So I think that's why the universe, or whatever your belief system is, steps in and says, no, we're just going to block that off for now. Right.
Too much to handle right now.
No, we can think about that later. Yeah. We'll let you see that stuff again when you're older and you're lonely and want someone to talk to.
Well, that makes perfect sense, though.
Yeah. Where do you think they exist? Where do you think fairies exist?
That is such a lovely existential question. I love it. I mean, I do think my own experiences and then what I've read, obviously, in folklore and talking to other people, kind of support that there's a world that is connected to ours, but not ours.
Like an interdimension, like dimensional kind of things?
It could be. I'm one of those people that I love contemplating it, but I also don't press too hard for clear answers, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I could certainly see it being interdimensional, parallel dimension, just a reality that's connected to ours, that's accessible from ours, and also, from theirs into ours, that has a lot of the same physical rules, but also has different rules at play as well, what we would call magic. But I'm sure if you live in that reality, it's not magic per se. It's something different. It's just another law of physics to them, I would think.
Yeah, their physics and our physics coming together, or what we think is physics, based on our human experience right now. But I think there's a few other things out there that'll overlap and be a conundrum.
Oh, yeah. Well,
that we're not going to learn until we die. So, and who knows, even if after that.
Well, yeah, there's that too. If you believe that there's an interdimensional realm or, parallel universe, then to my mind, why would there only be one?
Exactly.
So I think that's why we see these beliefs relating to different types of beings that, are all clearly not like, human world, if you will, that are coming to or going to somewhere else, but are clearly also not from the same place, diversity.
Oh, yeah, very much so. And, I'm wondering, too, I've always wondered this, like every so often we'll get somebody like you who has seen a fairy or something from the fairy realm step in and step out. I'm wondering if, the fairies are sitting around over a Guinness one day going, I was walking down that path and there's this two-legged thing came out of a corner and she saw me and I don't know what it is. And the other fairies are going, yeah, you're one of those weird people, weird fairies that see humans. They don't exist. Do they, as the group, as the fairy species, know humans exist, or are we like fairies to them, where some of them see us and some are going, they don't really exist? Like, what is a hierarchy of beings in all the dimensions? Who's got the best dimension?
Right. Well, that would definitely be a fascinating question to be able to answer. And I'm sure there are some who, if you ask most humans, we're going to say the human world's probably the best. Maybe not this year, but generally, I'm sure if you asked most fairies or, any other type of being, they'd probably say their reality is the best. But, when it comes to fairies, I think there probably are some who just stay in their own reality, if you will, and don't interact here, who would be skeptical that humans exist. But I do think there's some who intentionally interact, crossover, and that's been the case, back. We have, I think, the first story that we have in writing, at least in Ireland, dates back to, I believe, the 7th century Common Era, of a being that, we would in English refer to as a fairy, who came over and basically convinced the son of a king to go back with her to her realm, her world. And he was never seen again, because he left with her. But, it's been a long time that we've had these interactions and these beliefs. And, like you'd mentioned earlier with the Tinkerbell joke, some of them are not particularly positive to humans. Some of them definitely have a negative effect on humans that they interact with. And then others, we do have stories that have a more positive angle to them, where, the human in question comes out the better for it. So it's a lot going on.
There is definitely a lot going on out there. We are speaking to Morgan Daimler. She is an author of up to 30 books about all sorts of things. And right now we're only talking about the fairies. You're on various social medias, right? You're at Morgan Daimler on Twitter. Daimler is DAIMLER, like Daimler-Benz, the car.
Exactly, yes.
And you've written about paganism, Irish mythology, fairies, and articles in lots of related literature about those types of things. What you mentioned Ireland, and like going back to 700, and this prince that crossed over, let's call it.
Yeah.
Why so much in Ireland and Iceland and things like that? Like that whole kind of Nordic, that chunk of Europe. Things have been seen in Australia and Japan and South America, and even by Aboriginal population in North America here for centuries too. But we really have it expanded upon more in Ireland. Why so do you believe that? Or is it just because we in the mainstream North American, white person culture, we kind of have access to that literature?
I think probably that second one. I think I blame a lot of things on the Victorians, to be fair. I don't want to get off on a whole Victorian rant, but I think that if you look globally, you can find parallels or cognates to what we would call in Western European belief fairies pretty much everywhere that there's humans. I'm not saying those all are fairies, but beings that are similar, have similar ways of interacting with humans, sometimes similar descriptions, at the very least cousins to fairies. I think that when the Victorians were kind of the biggest cultural influence game in town, they really romanticized particularly Irish folklore, and kind of took the idea of fairies. They really changed it a lot, and sort of modified it into more of what we in popular culture today think of when we would think of a fairy, sort of the twee little that just wants everyone to be happy sort of a thing, which is definitely a post-Victorian view and not something we find, in most cultural beliefs and most folklore. And I think they kind of romanticize that idea of the otherworldly beings that we find in Ireland. And so the idea of it being really centered in Ireland became really popular, and has just sort of taken hold and continued. As you mentioned, there's also in Iceland, there's quite a strong belief. They call them the Huldafolk or Alfar there, but, roughly equivalent to the English word fairy or elf, which interestingly, fairy and elf used to be synonyms. So you'll see them used interchangeably a lot in the folklore. But that's a whole linguistic tangent I don't need to get on. And, you also find them in Scottish belief, Welsh, Cornish, Manx, specific parts of France, even in England, which is kind of a mashup of a bunch of different cultures coming together, but you have a lot of very distinct sort of English fairy folklore. And it's all really deeply embedded culturally, and a lot of times tied to very specific places, specific understandings of these beings connected to particular locations. So it's really fascinating how widespread it really is. even getting into Germany, those parts of Western Europe. Just a strong belief in these otherworldly beings who can either help or harm, but sort of have this intrinsic connection to humanity somehow.
Yeah, and the silly names that we put on them, depending on our religious beliefs or where we live. We can go from an elf to a demon pretty quick, or a fairy to a demon, just because of our belief system or what we're told. Even I always tell the story about the Pan, my spirit guide, was once called the Greek god of the hillside. Mm-hmm. And then Christianity came in, and it's like, oh, that thing has got to be a demon. And Pan standing on the hillside going, dude, I just exist, and you people keep putting labels on me. I went from a god to a demon. I didn't ask her either. So just leave me alone. And I think as we go around the world looking at these beings, if we all, if we had a description of one and showed it to all the different cultures, we'd have positive ideals of what they are and negative ones. Mm-hmm. Based on our belief system and our experiences. But it's the same thing going, come on, dude, I just exist. There's grumpy guys and there's happy humans, like good humans and bad humans. I'm just an elfin thingy from, Iceland that I happen to look exactly like the guy in New Zealand. So bouncing all over the place.
Yeah, it's definitely the human filter involved. Definitely has an effect, I think, on how things can be understood. Which is interesting in its own way. There's a good book. It's called by Richard Firth Green. It's called Elf Queens and Holy Friars, and it's sort of looking at English fairy belief in particular, kind of in the Middle Ages into the early modern period. But one of the things that he looks at is the way that the world of fairy, the other world, was understood and how that changed as Protestantism came in, because the Protestants had a particularly harsh view of fairies. They were definitely in the these are demons camp point of view. And how the world of fairy previously, when people would write about it, was kind of equated to paradise. It was described as this wonderful land with no disease and no death and no sin, which was, a big deal to Christian writers, and just sort of this wonderful place, like who wouldn't want to go there? And then as the Protestant writers came in and sort of took over, if you will, writing about it, it became much more purgatory, much more like not outright hell punishment, but much less pleasant. Not a place people would want to go, but a place people might be trapped or stuck in. And that to me is really fascinating to see how that perspective can really change the subject it's looking at.
It's filtered through a lens of the time, mm-hmm. and our beliefs as we were brought up, like anything else is really. When you walk down the street and you see something, or as a policeman, I come around a corner and I see a group of people act, just the vibration of them in a certain way, I can filter that through all the other experiences I've had with that a similar feeling with a similar group of people at that time of night at that corner. And now I go, I think I know what's going to happen here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could also, sort of compare it to spiders. Not that I'm comparing fairies to spiders, but rough analogy here. If you're raised to be afraid of spiders, if you're raised to think that they're dangerous and scary, and you should just kill all of them, then that's how you're going to understand them. As soon as you see any spider, you're immediately going to have that reflexive thought of, well, these are bad. If you're raised to look at them as just beings that exist and do their own thing, and some of them where I live, we do have 2 poisonous kinds of spiders. Some of them can be dangerous, but the majority of them are not, and you just kind of have to leave them alone and let them do their thing. And they won't bother you for the most part if you don't bother them. It's a completely different understanding of the exact same thing. just based on how you're taught, to understand what they are, really.
Oh yeah, we're prejudiced by our upbringing and our influences, or what we've taken as an influence by somebody else, or we perceive as authority growing up. Mm-hmm. Parents telling us to stay away from certain things, and and it's all, they're trying to be helpful. Oh yeah, but it builds again, like you say, a filter on how we experience things and how we see things. When I call fairies, like, I kind of clump them into this elemental world. It's kind of interesting because I deal a lot. I shouldn't say that. I talk to a lot of people about elemental beings, which covers, it's just kind of an umbrella term for all these things. And the base elemental beings are always the base elements, like, fire, earth, water, air. I guess there are elementals when you get down to that part, and then it breaks them down into the 4 categories and things, but I don't want to get too carried away into that. When you're dealing with the things that you've experienced in your life, and you look at them and bring them forward, and you compare them to what people see of Goat Man and Dog Man and Bigfoot and all these other things, in your understanding and in your research, because you write and you've interviewed people too, where do you fit in the modern cryptids, the mainstream cryptid belief system, connecting it to your experience in the otherworldly beings that you've written about?
Yeah, I think the whole subject of cryptids is really fascinating. Cryptids and sort of the related, urban legend kind of beings, the ones that are sort of on the fringe of, like black-eyed children. They're not exactly cryptids, but they're sort of in that same realm. When I look at them, I admit that I definitely have a certain bias that lends towards fairy for certain things. So I do see things like, say, Mothman, or the Jersey Devil, or even Chupacabra, are, in my mind, would tick certain boxes that would put them in the category or close to the category of otherworldly beings, of fairies. Something like Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, pick a name because there's so many. To me, I do generally wonder if that's not something that might be more tangibly of this world, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Just because they're, it's seen in such a similar way in, so many places, different continents even. And its behavior is definitely more what you would expect with an actual, human world animal, as opposed to, things like the Chupacabra, which are much more, seemingly supernatural. Not that I mean supernatural in a negative sense, just difficult to explain in a completely biological way. But I think there's so much still to be sort of understood in those categories. It's actually a real shame, I think, that cryptozoology and cryptids tend to be reacted to by most people with sort of amusement and skepticism, like not taken very seriously, even if it's just another sort of folklore, if we want to look at it that way. It deserves some really serious study and interpretation, I think. But I would put quite a lot of them into the category of fairies. But I have a huge bias, and I admit it. I fully own my bias. If the subject of UFOs and aliens ever comes up, I am very quick to say that I am in camp probably all fairies, because that's a huge and ongoing debate between certain communities. So I admit that I tend to lean in that direction until proven otherwise, which may not necessarily be the best approach. I could probably use a tiny bit more objectivity, but, at least I'm aware that I have the bias.
Well, you look at it as a bias, but I want you to look at it as a filter of what you know.
Yeah.
Placed up against something that you're not sure of. So you have a comfort zone, and when you were given a problem or shown something else, you're more comfortable looking at it from what you have experience with. So it's not like it's an over biased. It's just it makes you feel like you understand it a lot better.
Yeah, it gives me a point of reference to start from.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah, so you say things easier. It's almost like you write for a living. But what's interesting, I did a Bigfoot documentary. And we went
cool.
out on Vancouver Island here, and we actually got footprints.
Oh, wow.
Hundreds and hundreds of these giant footprints left in the camp.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And they were like 2.5 to 3 inches into the ground. So if somebody was out there all night pounding these things in, we definitely would have heard them because we weren't sleeping that well.
Right.
And they were all about 30 feet from the shacks we were allegedly sleeping in. It was definitely fascinating. And we heard sounds, and you're trying to write things off in your head. It's like, it couldn't be this, it couldn't be that, or maybe it's an owl with lips because it's whoop with a p sound at it. Right. But not too many large mammals on Vancouver Island that have that type of lip sounding whoop, and bears don't whoop. But it was interesting, and in interviewing people and coming away from that, I brought it up on this. I used to have a psychic. A couple of psychics used to come on an episode of mine called Two Mediums and a Large, and we were talking.
Sorry, I just got that. That's funny.
One of the things we talked about was Bigfoot, and they said, well, yeah, Bigfoot. People say it could be alien, and making a very long story short, but one of the psychics at one time, actually about 2015 to 2014, 2015-ish, most psychics around the planet, like real psychics, who talked to their spirit guide, their spirit guides would step back, and they had extraterrestrial beings came in. And one week, this Joanna, the medium, she called her guy Rob. He just gave him a name. And he came on one day and said, just ask me anything you want, as long as there's not conspiracies. Like, was 9/11, who killed JFK, that kind of thing. Right. And I said, what's a Bigfoot? And they do Bigfoot exist? And Rob says, yeah. It's an echo, EKKO, and they're alien beings protecting. And we didn't get it at the time, but the people talk about Bigfoot. It went behind the tree and then it disappeared. It's like, oh my God, it's interdimensional, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's the echo. The real Bigfoot are, like you say, they're critters, they're animals. But these beings come down and they're trying to keep humans away. So it's like the distractor. Hey, look at me. I'm going to run behind this tree, or I'm going to go this way. Meanwhile, the family is all booking it across the field the other direction. Right. That's the echo. So there's this weird symbiosis between an extraterrestrial race looking after what is base, these animal critter kind of things. And then went off on this long tangent on why they're being protected and why humans have to stay away from them. And it came back to, like, this could be our original DNA that was used to produce the offshoots of what human beings are now, therefore that's trying to be protected. So it was off this whole other thing, but the actual Bigfoot Sasquatch itself was just an animal. It's a critter that lives here, but is being, is just pushed off away from us. And
sort of in protective custody.
Yeah. And allegedly the government's also involved in protecting them from us too, or protecting them from us, I should say. But yeah, it's very interesting how that worked, that whole, but they fit in their, I shouldn't say they fit in, but as far as cryptozoology goes, they are their own thing. They are outside of that whole goat man, Mothman, Jersey Devil kind of thing. They just exist. Okay, this is a Bigfoot. This is a Sasquatch. We'll move those over there. We'll just ignore them as being anything that's too spooky to worry about. Now, these other interdimensional possibilities, we'll talk about those. Yeah, no, they definitely, I 100% agree. They definitely are their own category. And then there's everything else. Does one of the questions I had here for you was, does older mythology influence modern understanding of the supernatural?
I think it can. I also think sometimes it should, where it doesn't. So I do think that sometimes, and that gets into sort of where we were talking about filters earlier, if you have a strong understanding of certain types of folklore, then that's going to be sort of your filter. That's going to be your basis, and that is going to influence how you understand things and sort of how you immediately conceptualize things. So, there have been cases, for example, there's, again, this is from a book, it's called Strange Terrain. It's about fairy encounters in Newfoundland. And there's a case that's mentioned in there in the 1980s of someone who was working, I believe, logging. And, everyone breaks for lunch. The crew sort of goes their separate ways to eat. And when they get back together an hour later to resume work, one of the guys is missing. And they look for him for 3 days, no trace of him, no idea where he went. He's just gone, basically. And then I believe it's after the third day, they're continuing to work, and the guy just walks out of the woods. And of course, they're all like, "Where have you been?" And he's baffled because he's like, "Well, it's only been an hour. I just went and had lunch. I'm not late coming back." And they're all trying to explain to him, "No, it's been 3 days. You've been missing. You've been gone. We've all been looking for you." Major drama. And his story was he had gone a little ways into the woods to eat his lunch where it would be quieter and run into this group of people who was also eating, and they had invited him to join them. And he had sat down and eaten his lunch with them and, had a conversation and then gotten up and come right back. And from a fairy lore perspective, and, the reason it's in this book about fairies in Newfoundland, that's a very classic fairy encounter where the person is missing for a period of time, thinks that a much shorter amount of time has passed than actually has passed. Everyone else is looking for him, can't find him. However, if you don't have that fairy lore background, if you're not into fairy beliefs, and I just told you the story up to that point and asked, what do you think it was? A lot of people would say alien abduction. That he was abducted by aliens and put back, because that also has these markers of missing time, people not realizing that they've been gone, things along those lines. So, definitely that filter that you bring to a situation or to hearing an anecdote is going to affect how you interpret it, what you think happened. And I think it's interesting sometimes the way that a situation that could have been one specific thing gets sort of reinterpreted as something else. Hence why I joke about being aware of my own biases. But then again, maybe we're all wrong and it's option C, and we're just putting the wrong labels on all of it anyway.
Yeah, for the listener who doesn't know much about Newfoundland, it's basically Ireland West. It's there's a interesting story in Newfoundland. It's called the Fairies of Conception Bay, going back to the 1940s, where little deaf mute boy was out picking blueberries and kind of walked away from his family and kind of heard these throaty squawks, and they went to find him, and they found the missing boy, and he was just flipping out of his mind, distraught, and he calmed down and basically drew on a piece of paper what had happened. He drew a picture of a short man resembling a dwarf with a long beard and a red pointy hat. There's a long history of fairy encounters in Newfoundland.
Yep.
And I think there are probably long lists of fairy encounters all over the place, but in Newfoundland, because of the Irish connection, because most of the people there are of Irish ancestry, they weren't afraid to talk about it, because this is just like, oh, my grandmother used to tell me stories about this, and they're the folklore in Newfoundland around fairies it's well known, and it is. My beliefs, anyway, so belief that's connected to that Scottish-Irish and background from the 1600s when people first started coming over there. I think a book just Googled it, Strange Terrain, the Fairy World in Newfoundland.
It's a very good book. It's fascinating stuff because it's all stories from like the 80s. Well, not all, but it includes stories from like the 1980s. And I think too often people get this idea that this is all like historic. This all happened a long time ago. I mean, you might think the 80s was a long time ago too. I don't know. I don't know how young this audience is, but
oh, not that young.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago.
Back in the 80s. When I was a kid, we don't have no fancy cell phones. Oh yeah, we did. Never mind. We are talking to Morgan Daimler. Please Google her, Morgan Daimler, Daimler, author of many, many books in regards to folklore, cryptids, fairies, anything like this. You were talking about the missing phenomena tied to folklore, but earlier you also you have that interesting perception on ufology, UFOs, and aliens and fairies. And what do you mean by that? Do you kind of connect the two?
Yeah, so there's sort of two viewpoints that happen. There's people who are very into ufology and aliens who will argue that historic accounts of abductions and encounters that are labeled as fairies are actually aliens, have always been aliens. And then there's the camp that I'm in, which takes the opposite view, which says that we have these stories that go back for quite a long time of fairies abducting people and, sometimes bringing them back, sometimes not. And that when we hit the modern period and science fiction became a thing, and people, instead of having that folklore filter, started having this science fiction filter, then we start to see those same abductions and same encounters, but told through the lens of alien abductions. I believe 1960 was the first abduction experience that's public, as far as I know, off the top of my head that I remember. And that now, because fairies have this ability to deceive the senses of a human being, make you think you're seeing things that aren't there, and even to the point of tasting and smelling and all this other stuff, things that aren't there. And again, that goes back in folklore mythology a very long ways, that power. It's called glamour now. That they're just giving the person what the person expects. If you don't have a frame of reference for fairies, but you have a frame of reference that includes aliens, then you're going to have an experience that fits your expectations, even though it's still fairies. So there's sort of these two very antithetical viewpoints. I tend to fall into the camp that I think a lot of alien encounters and abductions probably are what you would perhaps call interdimensional beings as opposed to extraterrestrial beings, fairies, because many of them continue to check those boxes for what we would expect from fairy abductions and fairy encounters, like that story I just told about the Newfoundland experience. Time runs differently, so a person will experience just a few hours, sometimes even just a few minutes, and then waking up or coming back into this world, it's been days, sometimes weeks or longer. Sometimes they won't remember very clearly what happened. Sometimes they do, but it's very fantastical. There's stories that involve lights in the trees that, sort of not ground level, but in amongst the trees that people would see or people would follow. Being offered food, being, the modern view would be experimented on, but the older stories, it tended to be more, used for entertainment purposes in various ways. Some of the experiences were very bad and very traumatic for the person. Others were sort of euphoric. Sometimes the person would come back or wake up and have some physical mark or even disfigurement, something that had clearly happened without any sort of earthly explanation. Those are all things that are sort of marks of fairy encounters. And those are also very similar to a lot of what people describe with modern alien abductions. I am always open to evidence and discussion. My opinion on this is flexible. And I do believe that there's more out there than just humans, whether it's interdimensionally or extraterrestrially or what have you. But I do think that a lot of what we now tend to put into that sci-fi sort of filter, probably 100 years ago, 150 years ago, would have just been understood as fairies.
Okay, yeah. Because that was an easy connection for them to make. When you're walking through the woods and you see a little 3-foot tall gray being and lost some time, you do, that must have been a fairy.
Yep.
Now we can go, oh, no, hold on. Travis Walton said he was in a ship with one of those.
Yep.
And, yeah. Interesting. Are you familiar with, and this is kind of, I'm going to bring this up in the fairy realm kind of connection, but are you familiar with the Liverpool time slips?
Yeah.
Boyd Street? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Where you're walking down the street in 1996 and the next thing you know, you're in 1950 on the same street.
Yeah.
And everyone around you is wearing, like, you're in period costume. It's not like you zipped over and you saw a car. It's like the entire street is... have you kind of put that through your fairy filter?
I'm a little torn on whether things like that are to do with things that would, we would call fairies, or maybe even, nature, land spirits, things like that. Or whether that's more of that phenomena where you have such a strong emotional imprint in a location that it creates that sort of almost like echo effect. You see it in hauntings sometimes where, you go to, in the U.S. anyway, you would go to a Civil War battlefield and you can still hear the cannons and the guns.
I did that.
Yeah.
Yeah. My friend and I on a Sunday afternoon in Gettysburg, we heard the report of 2 cannons.
Yep.
Echoes. And we both kind of looked at each other like, you heard that, right? And I said, yeah, I heard that. And we asked one of the tour guides, and he says, yeah, the people hear them all the time, but there are no cannons in this area. Yep. So anyway, we go on. Yeah, because I thought, I'm part of your story. I heard that.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. I think sometimes you just have an intense enough, a strong enough moment or energy to something that it can kind of overlay, and you can step into it and experience it. And I honestly don't know exactly what we would like properly call that. I've experienced it where I live. There's a Revolutionary War era fort. And I was there one night at twilight and looked over and I could see a soldier walking where the rampart would have been, and you could hear gunfire. So that was a little intense.
Yeah. Well, see, to me, so, I look at that as residual energy.
Yeah.
And not like a ghost or something.
Right. Yeah, it definitely wasn't a ghost. You couldn't interact with it. You couldn't talk to it, or,
They're kind of like on a time loop. They're like on a loop. They just repeat the same thing over and over again. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's a classic stories about the fields in Belgium where farmers for the last 100 years have been seeing sporadic soldiers coming up out of the ground and running. And they're literally guys coming out of the trenches in World War I.
Yep.
But they're not ghosts. They're just imprints on time, probably a higher vibration person, absolutely scared, terrified, pumped full of adrenaline, just left a mark.
Yep.
That's why they're not hundreds of them coming up out of the trenches like they really were. They're just sporadic.
Yeah, just those few.
And they're on a loop. They'll see the same ones all the time. Another classic one is in Gettysburg, where you see this guy it's on a video, runs from one tree to another tree. And he could have died, that day, or survived the war and died of old age. But at that point in time, he imprinted.
Yep, that energy was so intense.
Yeah, repetitive, too. There's a Bath in England. There's people who've seen a little platoon of Roman soldiers on patrol, and they see them sticking out of the ground from the knees up, because they're walking on the original road, which was 600 years ago or whatever it was, or more, 1,000 years ago. So that's just an imprint because it was repetitive for many, many years of patrols. It's interesting you saw that. That is really cool.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience. And where I live, we have stories like that, not that specific one, but, other people who have seen, there's one particular road that's well known for people seeing a Revolutionary War soldier walking down the side of the road. And it's one of those, if you stop thinking it's a human that needs a ride, he'll be gone. And that's the same thing. It's obviously just an imprint. It's not an actual spirit. He must have really, really wanted to get wherever he was trying to go.
Yeah, just, focused and really creating a lot of energy at the time.
Yeah.
And who knows, drawing in some energy from around him too. Just basically what we would call an empath, or an extremely high vibration person now, and either frightened or determined or something that got his energy up where it actually imprinted.
Yeah, leaves that mark.
You have a book, it's called The New Dictionary of Fairies, 21st Century Exploration of Celtic and Related Western European Fairies. If I wanted that book, where do I go for it?
Hopefully anywhere. You can definitely get it on Amazon. It should be on Barnes & Noble. Book Depository, pretty much any bookstore. If they don't have it, if you ask, they should be able to get it. That's of everything I've ever written, that's the book I'm the most proud of. I put a lot of my heart into that book. I mean, I realize it's a dictionary as I say that, but a lot of effort.
You mean. Yeah. Well, it would be a lot of effort. Imagine somebody, actually, just a regular dictionary, imagining sitting down and say, I'm going to write words, and then I'm going to put that research and find out what they mean and put that beside the words, and I'll call it a dictionary. Yeah, it's going to take a lot of work. It's not like it's a conscious flow of thought into story form. No, it's I could see that as being a work of the heart, and a lot of work into that.
Yeah, definitely. I would much rather write fiction for the record, than ever do a dictionary again. But that dictionary, I'm very proud of it. I think it came out really well. A lot of research went into it, and it mostly covers what we would call Celtic language speaking. So Irish, Scottish, Welsh, all of that kind of constellation of beings. But I do talk in there about aliens and fairies, now that I'm thinking of it, and some of the stuff that we've talked about in the interview. I'm sure I'm much more coherent in the book.
Oh, you're coherent now. It's me that's usually fumbling all over things. We talked a little bit about ghosts and connecting ghosts to fairies. Do you see a connection between dead humans and those little flitty fairies?
Such a complicated question. I love it. I think if we're talking about ghosts in the sense of disembodied human spirits, that would definitely be a separate category. If we're talking about dead humans, however, that gets really complicated. There's a lot of belief, and again, I realize I keep saying this, but that goes back quite a ways, that the fairies would take human beings, sometimes, living human beings. That's sort of where we get the idea of changelings from, but also that they would take people who had recently died or were dying, and that they would, once they'd taken those people through a process that they had, would turn that human then into one of their own people, would turn them into a fairy. And, we have accounts of things like that. People who saw the fairies or, wandered into the world of fairy and encountered people that they had known from their community that were thought to have died, that were now, among the fairy host, among the fairies. There's an account, and I know it's from Ireland. I'm not going to remember the exact date on it, but it was a young boy, I want to say he's like 8 or 9, who was taken by the fairies, and he was gone for 3 days, and then he returned, which was not usually how that happened. Usually if someone was taken and intended to be kept, they were just gone. And he explained that when he'd been taken, the fairies had basically spent the time more or less trying to purify everything earthly from him. They'd taken his clothes, they'd washed him, they'd been trying to get him to eat fairy food, but unbeknownst to the fairies, he had a little piece of a thorn underneath one of his fingernails. And because they didn't know it was there, they couldn't find it to get it out. They had no choice after 3 days but to send him back. And so he returned to his family and told them this whole story about what had happened, which sort of seems to indicate that when they take a person, if you still have a connection to the human world, if you still have anything sort of earthly about you, they can't keep you. They have to return you. But if they can purge all of that, if they can get rid of all of it, then they can keep you and turn you into a fairy. And of course, we have older folklore about that as well, the idea of them taking people. So connection between the human dead and fairies gets really complicated really quickly. There definitely is one. The biggest difference, I would say, between ghosts and humans who might end up with as fairies is, ghosts as we understand them are relatively intangible, usually require certain circumstances to be able to interact with our world or be seen and experienced in our world. Whereas fairies, in most accounts, can be tangible. They are not always, but they can be, can interact tangibly with anyone that they choose to at any time. So they can be seen, they can talk to people, things like that. And can be much more directly interactive. I would think those are some of the the big sort of differences between the two.
Okay. Well, we kind of talked off air a bit about this. My youngest daughter, who's 18, has been described by numerous people who don't know her, who have seen things, or psychic, or mediums and things, as fairy realm. And we were talking at one time about, if the world came to an end tomorrow, what would happen to this person or that person, and what happens to us. And I happened to mention my youngest daughter, and it had two psychics who said, I was talking to, and they said, we don't have to worry about her, they'll just come and bring her back.
Yeah, she'll be fine.
Yeah, she'll be fine. They will just take her back. So it's kind of funny, maybe funny, not haha funny, but I'm thinking when you were talking about fairies taking dead people and bringing them over, maybe those people were fairy realm to start with, and they were just bringing them home.
It's certainly possible. There's so much folklore and so many accounts that talk about fairies having physical connections, ancestral connections with humans. And it's funny because when this topic comes up, people tend to laugh and act like it's a joke, but it's quite a thing across folklore. The idea that a human can have a fairy ancestor, or that, fairies and humans can produce children together. And that's something we see across folklore. Like you see that in Iceland, you see it in Germany, you see it in Ireland. You kind of see it all over the place. If you have a belief in these beings, then there's also an idea that they, sometimes will, reproduce, to put it nicely, with humans. Then you end up with these children who sort of have connections in both directions, have ancestry in both directions, and also just the idea that they'll take people and change them, make them one of their own. So that metamorphosis kind of aspect is in there too. So it's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm not that my ex was a fairy that I had a daughter with, because I had my other daughter is completely she is just a higher vibration person.
Yeah.
Empath, but like a through the roof flipping empath. But she's not fairy realm. But Natalie, my God, she's this Nordic 5'11" dancer, and she's completely different. Like her energy it's sparkly.
Yeah. Not
sparkly in a bad thing. Like a lot of times I'll see people's energy that's sparkly like a Roman candle or sparklers, which means, basically they're not focused energy, but hers is just different. It's
bright.
Very, very interesting vibe about her. And and again, she's definitely not Tinkerbell. I think if you crossed her, she would kill you and eat you. But so yeah, real fairy. But that's my 18-year-old. She'll do stuff. But yeah, she's very, very interesting, and her energy definitely shows that there is something else there, and that she's connected. So it makes sense when people said, "Oh yeah, she's fairy realm," and you don't have to. And I'm always getting, you don't have to worry about her. She's fine.
Yeah.
She can they will take care of her, and she can take care of herself. Okay.
It seems like people who have that connection, again, whether we're talking about in stories or anecdotes or, people's personal experiences, there's always just something about them that other people kind of recognize. It's subtle, but it's not that subtle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just something there. There's just something, and I'm a big people person. I'm a big people watcher, and I love looking at just watching groups of people and watching them interact. And over my lifetime, I've kind of can focus on certain traits in a person, and kind of prejudge them relatively quickly on the way they act. And now looking back in hindsight after turning onto this woo-woo side of me, I go, oh, that's why you can do that. But yeah, she's always been something. And there are people I've seen like her, that are in a similar vibe to her. And I know she's completely different than the rest of the family.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Well, yeah. I assumed you meant it in a good way.
Yeah, and if we ever get attacked by monsters, I throw her out first, so she'll kill them all. Yeah. She's the kind of a dancer version of Joan of Arc in the family. She's all smiles and giggles, and I think if you pressed the wrong button, she would cut your head off. But,
right.
But she's a cutie when she does it. The supernatural beings like this, like my daughter. No, when we talk about supernatural things, even the term supernatural, because of media, it kind of automatically gets half the population rolling their eyes going, yeah, okay, what are you going to talk about? Frankenstein's monster. Like, we get into all these weird connections from, anything ufological to Bigfoot and all the other little cryptids we talked about and things like that. It just opens a can of worms.
Right.
We get off into from anything from Hobbit to Harry Potter. We move in multiple different directions at light speed. But the stories about the fairy and the fae and things like that, and they're pretty constant. They all describe similar attributes to the beings themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's like over the centuries and over various continents. So as somebody reading it or looking at it from the outside, you kind of think, well, unless this writer in Japan was influenced by this person in Iceland, I don't see how they would know about a similar being at the time. Or up here on the Pacific Northwest, we have, of course, everyone's heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch in this part of the world, but there is another being, and I'll be darned if I can remember what it's called, but it's like it's like, what were they called in Star Wars? The little furry beings in the forest. They're only about 3 feet tall and furry.
Ewoks?
Yeah. So these Ewok, we have in British Columbia, in the northwestern side of the province, the First Nations there in history have talked about the little short 2.5 to 3 foot tall furry beings. Mm-hmm. And there are more stories about them than Bigfoot. But Bigfoot was the scary one, so everything was talked about the old man of the forest.
Right, focused on that.
Compared to the little ones that, are running around under the ferns. But those types of stories are prolific, but they're also very common in South America, too. Mm-hmm. And you get, when you start looking at these two groups in the supernatural filter, they always become scary. But in real life, they've always been just what they were. They were just things that lived in the forest. Why are we worrying about them? Right.
Ambivalent, just like every other living thing.
Yeah. It's like going when I did my the Bigfoot documentary. There was a fellow with us, First Nations gentleman here, who his belief system is Bigfoot is an animal. It's a critter. It's got all the woo-woo stuff he doesn't take in at all. And he'll go to reservations in the United States, talking to them about their Bigfoot challenges. And he says, well, it's not really challenges. They just they talk about it as they look at white people coming in saying, oh my God, did you see Bigfoot? And they look at him like, yeah, just like Bigfoot's here, just like the clouds are in the sky and the mountain is on the horizon. So what's the big deal? Yeah, but have you seen them? Yeah, I've seen them. Why, you haven't? Oh, I want to see one. It's like, just calm down then. Like, it's okay. Yeah. It's not a big deal. For us, it's not a big deal. For you, it's a big deal. Right. For us, it's been around here for centuries, and I've seen them. My grandmother saw them. My great grandmother saw them. It's just it's part of the flora and fauna that we live with. It's
just a part of the reality.
Yeah, it's just us Europeans that kind of blow a gasket over stuff like that. And I think that's like fairies too. We just they just existed. They existed, and people in Ireland and Iceland and Newfoundland, to a point, have always known they were there, and they write about them, but they don't write about them as being spooky or supernatural. They just, they exist. Move on.
It's really interesting. I've been to Ireland, and I've also been to Iceland, and it's that level of belief where it just is sort of taken as it's here. If you ask people, a lot of people will say, no, of course I don't believe in this, because 21st century, I don't want to look silly. Yeah. But they still won't, they won't interfere with a fairy tree. They won't go certain places after dark. They won't do things that are considered to be disrespectful to these beings. And Ireland and Iceland both have had cases in the last 20 years where roads were rerouted not to interfere with, places associated with fairies. So it's that level of belief where it's just taken as fact. It just is, I think there's a Terry Pratchett quote. He was talking about gods, but the same concept that, it's like asking if you believe in the gods. It's like asking if you believe in the postman. Like, of course you're going to say no, you don't believe in it, because you just know that it is. That's a very badly paraphrased quote, by the way.
So you put a little bracket, sick bracket, like SIC. Yeah. Right? It's sort of the quote, which I think is what SIC stands for. Sort of issue the quote. Who knows? Sort of is quote. That's what it is. Sort of is quote. So the way we look at things nowadays, through the filter of television and fiction, and being influenced, reading a lot of fiction, again, supernatural books. It's one of those super words: supernatural, superstition, all these influences we growing up. It's really interesting how we are then influenced in our perception. And we look at, again, the folklore, the fiction, and what you've actually, I think, talked about, fake lore. How it's influenced. But shouldn't they all be treated equally?
Oh, that's a question that has a lot of opinion attached to it on my end.
Well, throw your opinion in. That's why you're here.
I will.
Your opinion, because I end up throwing mine in all the time.
So fake lore, or folkloresque is another term for it, is basically when a modern person, a contemporary person, invents something and puts it out as legitimate folklore. And sometimes it's done, with intentional bad intentions. And sometimes it's done more, for different motivations, whether it's entertainment or what have you. I tend to struggle a lot with the invented modern material, partially because I think when we're looking at folklore, you're looking at a body of belief where, the people who tell these stories, the people who won't cut down that fairy tree and won't go to that certain place at night, it's because they genuinely believe that these beings exist and deserve respect or fear or what have you. When we're talking about the modern created material, it's entertainment. It's something that really comes from a place of, someone's trying to tell a good story or create something that seems fun. And it's not something that's rooted in the same source concept, I guess, is the way to look at it. Obviously we could get into a really deep philosophical conversation about whether fairies actually tangibly exist or not. And if they don't, then none of this matters because it was all just fiction at some point anyway. But if they do, then I think that's a different concept, really, that we have to look at. But either way, in that whole gigantic philosophical conversation to the side, when we talk about folklore, we're talking about beliefs, and oftentimes cultural beliefs that are attached to particular regions and communities and groups of people. And my biggest issue with the modern invented stuff, beyond all the other things I just mentioned, is that a lot of it is overwriting the older and the still living folkloric beliefs, and replacing them with things that are just easier to access with mass media. And this can get really problematic in multiple ways. But, in part, it's destroying and erasing the beliefs that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, because those beliefs are being lost, they're not being passed on, they're not being continued. And instead, people are kind of looking to these other sources. And then it also gets a little problematic in that a lot of time, we touched on this much earlier, talking about the popularity of Irish fairies in particular. A lot of times you have people who are outside of a particular culture, a particular group, who are making up things, but then putting that cultural label on it to try to give it that authentic feel. And sometimes that is not being done in the best way. For example, there's an American author, I believe he's from Missouri, but I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. And in his novels, he writes fiction, he includes the concept of the fairy courts, which comes from Scottish folklore originally, which is fine. He modifies them a little bit because it's fiction, but he gives them each a queen. And the queens that he chooses are taken from Shakespeare. So he has English fairy queens leading these Scottish fairy courts. And that just is very sort of tone deaf, and a little awkward given even the modern politics of England and Scotland. Another example, there's a fairy that you'll run across online called the Banti, Beantighe is how it's spelled. It's Irish. And it was basically invented in 2006 to be this sort of Irish house fairy, because they don't really have those in actual Irish belief. And it's gotten very popular. It's been written about in books now, and a lot of people talk about it, but it literally does not exist. It's not a thing in Irish folklore. People in Ireland will have no idea what you're talking about if you mention this. And the name that they used, Banti or Bonanti, it just means housekeeper, woman of the house in Irish. So the whole thing is kind of a very confused muddle. And it's just not an Irish belief. It's something else that was sort of, just labeled as that to make it sound better. And, in both of those cases, you're talking about cultures who their own folklore, their own folk belief is getting more obscure. And if you ask people, who are the queens of these fairy courts, in my experience, because I have done this a couple times on social media, people will give you the ones from that fiction series because that's their frame of reference. They've only read the fiction. Even if you ask for sources, what's your favorite source on fairy folklore? The number of times I've been given fiction series or the names of authors who write fiction series, because people just aren't differentiating at all between what is written for entertainment and what is actual, belief folklore. That's a very awkward way to put that, but there's no, especially for people who are living in cultures that don't have a really strongly embedded belief in fairies, like in the United States, for example, unless you happen to live in a diaspora community, because there are some Irish American and Scottish American communities here. the bulk of people don't have that. They don't grow up with that. So they're kind of searching for it, and they're landing with fiction, and then taking that into belief and sort of forwarding it, even though sometimes it has these problems. And I realize I just went off on a little bit of a rant, so I apologize.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, it's I've always believed that, making a being up is in producing fiction. Eventually, those beings will cross over into folklore. Whether I interviewed a fellow on the folklore, basically to do with vampires. And putting a stake through the heart and holy water and things like that. He goes through and kind of dissects where the vampire killing kit was actually originally the reason it was originally made, and it was all based on reading vampire or history books, and actually Graham Stoker's Vampire. That's where it got a lot of the vampire killing lore from, was a fiction created. And then we have hanging garlic and sticking a stake through the heart. Well, somebody posted on one of my YouTube or the YouTube on that story was, pretty well, you stick a stake through anything's heart, it's going to kill it. And the stake through the heart was one of the things. What they would do is, when they felt that, and this goes back to when our relatives showed up in the colonies, if you died and there was still illness in your family, they would think that you were a vampire, and they'd dig you up and cut your heart out and either burn it or eat it or make a soup out of it.
Yeah, beheading was common too.
Yeah, so it wasn't like, okay, we're gonna put a stake through the heart. No, they made a stake with your heart. Like you ate it, or they made a soup out of it. It just got changed through time, and it became what we perceive. If you're going to talk to some kid about vampires, here, describe vampires to me. What do? They describe exactly what the fiction vampire is, and how to kill it was the fiction stuff. But the reality was, it was far and away different than what was originally believed to be a vampire. The reality was
a little more gruesome, I think.
Oh yeah, the reality is scarier than, is like most times it's scarier than the fiction. But I thought brownies were the kitchen elves, or
in Scotland. Yep.
In Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
So they just added that Brunada thing or whatever it is to the
Banty. Yep.
Yeah, the Banty. Yeah. So that was just an amplification of the existing folklore.
Well, it was a case of people kept asking, I think, what's the Irish version of the brownie? And there isn't one, is the answer. There is none. Mm-hmm. But it became this thing where people outside of Ireland invented one and then sort of tried to insert it in. And that's where my issue comes in with it, is the external insertion, if you will. Folklore definitely evolves, things change. A lot of what Shakespeare wrote about fairies was probably Shakespeare making stuff up, loosely based on beliefs at his time. But a lot of it now is taken, as folklore, as fairy belief. So I do 100% agree that stuff that ends up in fiction oftentimes will work its way into actual belief, and that the beliefs themselves, the beings themselves, how we connect to them, how we interact with them, what have you, evolves and changes over time. I think we're just in a particularly odd place in history because that used to be a very organic process. And because of the speed of social media, because of the ease of the internet and the fact that really anyone can write anything, and put it up now, it's kind of exponentially quickened how information gets out there, whether that information is good or bad, and how quickly people will adopt these beliefs and change their viewpoints based on whatever framework they happen to have, whether that's fiction or folklore.
Or an overbearing mother.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or all three. Yeah, or all three.
Yes. Do you think a goblin is a fairy?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, this is one of those things that, up until fairly recently, the words fairy, elf, and goblin, and imp and incubus were all synonyms. They were all used interchangeably. So you'll find older sources that, in the same couple sentences will use a combination of all of those for the same exact being.
Well, I was going to actually, before I let you go, I was going to run something else by you. You were talking about the fairies intermingling with humans and creating offspring.
It's always fun to try to find the right word to use for that. Yeah.
Laying with. There you go. They laid with the humans. You get into, and the other side of the thing was the ghost connection, but succubus and incubus. Mm-hmm. To me, that's more of a human ghost being just a jerk.
I love that description. We'll have to remember that.
Yeah, but it's not the same. I'm not thinking that this is how a fairy then copulates with a human being. It would be. It's my guess that that's not an incubus or a succubus.
No. I think the reason that they kind of got tagged with that synonym, that the word came to be associated. So we see things like elvish incubi in like Montgomery's works in the 16th century, is because they were known, the fairies were known for being really overtly sexual and very prone to, as you said, lying with humans. And so I think incubus in that sense was being used as more of a catch-all term for, this is a non-human entity that really likes to get it on with humans, as opposed to a literal definition of what that actually is.
Oh, those little imps. Fairies.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to know. It's good to know that. This has been fun. You're going to have to come back because you've got tons of info that I want to talk to you about. More to do with, aliens and cryptids and stuff like that. And I'm going to try and grab your fairy dictionary too, because that's going to be kind of cool.
Yeah, I'd love to come back.
Yeah, I could do that for my my fairy daughter. We could do that. And we also did talk about your newest production little book that came out on Pagan Portal. It's called Raven Goddess.
Yes.
What was that? The Raven Goddess, what's that touch on?
It's about the goddess, the Morgan, who's an Irish goddess. I had written a book about her in 2014. And because the Pagan Portals are short, sort of introductory books, that one, the first one, really is just a brief overview and introduction to who the Morgan is and isn't, and the very basic of who she is, because she's a very complicated goddess that we have quite a lot of material on. And I always wanted to go back and add a little more to that. So I finally did. I wrote a second book, also a Pagan Portal, that really looks at sort of digging into disambiguating some of the confusions that people have around her, looking at in more detail some of her appearances in the mythology. I translate Old Irish for fun as a hobby. So everyone needs a weird hobby. So I looked at a lot of the original myths in the original language and kind of talk about what they're actually saying as opposed to how they get sort of retold. Not that the retellings are a bad thing, but just I found it really interesting to look at what the original versions were saying. And I dig into, what things are associated with her and colors and animals and all that kind of stuff from the mythology. So it was a lot of fun to write. And I hope that it has a lot of good information that people would find interesting, because there's just so much you can say about her.
And her name is Morgan.
The Morgan, yep.
The Morgan. And you're just Morgan. Coincidence? I think not. We've been talking to Morgan Daimler. Please Google her. Follow her on Twitter. You got a Facebook account too, Morgan?
I do. I have a Facebook author page. That's actually probably the best way to keep up with what I'm getting into with writing and interviews like this, and workshops when I do them, conferences when I do them, things like that. Pretty much everything ends up on my Facebook author page. Sadly, Facebook is the center of the universe right now.
Yes.
Yeah. I emphasize sadly.
And it's a Morgan Daimler on your Facebook page too?
Yep. I tried with all my social media to just use my name. So everything is pretty much under Morgan Daimler, because it seemed like the easiest option at the time. I do have a secret Tumblr account for when I'm feeling particularly snarky, and that is not under my name. That's under something else.
And don't look up Daimler Morgan, because that's a guy, University of Nairobi in Kenya. But definitely go.
Fun to know.
Yeah,
that's definitely not me.
Okay, so I have actually sent you a friend request.
Cool.
Morgan Daimler, and remember, guys, I'm saying Daimler, but it's Daimler, like Daimler Benz, because we say it differently here in Canada. Daimler.
Yes, it's a good German name.
It's a good German name. Yeah, Morgan Daimler author page. So drop in there, and I will be sending Morgan this podcast, so you could listen to it on her page eventually too, if you get a chance to click on it. And I want to thank you very much. Oh, and if you're looking to find a book, oh my gosh, she's got a couple, about 30 of them. Here's just a couple. Again, the New Dictionary of Fairies, 21st Century Exploration of Celtic and Related Western European Fairies, Traveling the Fairy Path, Pagan Portals, Brigid, am I saying it right? Brigid, yeah. Brigid, Meeting the Celtic Goddess of Poetry, Forge and Healing Well, Fairycraft, Following the Path of Fairy Witchcraft, Pagan Portals, Odin, Meeting the Norse Allfather, and Pagan Portals, Irish Paganism, Reconstructing Irish Polytheism, which is like way over my head. And then the one that just came out, Pagan Portal, a Raven Goddess, talking about the Morgan. Thanks very much, Morgan, for dropping by.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
Watching you while you sleep all alone.
All right, that's it. Let's roll. And hey! Let's be careful out there.
Far over the snow, what are those voices? They sing as they go. What are those voices? Look up for the mountains. Because somebody hide, somebody better hide through the hill, like a pack of angry wolves on the trail. We are after you, dead or alive. We are out to get you, dead or alive. And forget your toes. If you're the one, better run away. Son, you are done. Throw your gun away. Here come the Mounties to get the men that are now. Run through the hill like a pack of angry wolves on the trail. Dead or alive, we are out to get you, dead or alive. If you're the one, better run away. Son, you are done. Throw your gun away. Here come the Mounties to get the man they're after. No!